Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the At the Water's Edge podcast. We look for insights beyond the headlines to take a practitioner's view on national security and geopolitics. It's the 17th of March, 2026. Let's get started. Now, as we've moved from the global war on terror into the era of great power competition, the African continent has emerged as a hotbed of competition between great powers who use their influence to try to access different resources that are critical to the global economy, especially the semiconductor industry. Now, Africa is a huge place. The Mercator map doesn't give it justice, but one particular location in Africa that has been critical to American national security interests has been the Sahel region, where we have had special operations personnel and some conventional troops operating consistently throughout the global war on terror, and where we continue to monitor and assess risks. The Sahel region has become a hotbed for global terrorism, supporting numerous violent extremist organizations and terrorist groups internationally. It has seen the intervention of several Western powers, most particularly France. Now, to help us unpack what's going on in this region and how it ties to international terrorism and global security and stability, we have a wonderful guest on today. He is Fidel Amakye Owusu, the CEO of DevSec Analytics Africa, a geopolitical risk consulting firm. Really excited to get his take all the way from Ghana on what's going on in the Sahel and how it impacts the broader African continent and the global economy.
Hey, this is Brent Skinner, host of Small Talk Window here at the Work Defined Podcasting Network. Have you ever wanted a short podcast to listen to during a coffee break of your workday? You've come to the right place. My guests dispense with the small talk as quickly as possible and settle into a meaningful conversation around the world of work.
All right. Well, good morning from me and good afternoon to you. Welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, sir. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. Now, could you please introduce yourself in your own words for the audience, for folks who aren't familiar with your work?
I'm Fidel Amakye Owusu, the Chief Executive Officer of DevSec Analytics Africa, a consultancy firm that is focused on geopolitical risk and security in Africa. We deal with all the 6 regional security complexes in Africa: Horn of Africa, Central Africa, Southern Africa, North Africa, and Western Africa. So that is what we do. We look at all the geopolitical risk, both vertical and horizontal, across the various regions. Thank you.
Awesome. One of the most interesting parts of Africa, and an area that in a previous life of mine, when I was in 3rd Special Forces Group with the U.S. Army, we spent a lot of time focusing on, is the Sahel. It's got a lot of interesting stuff going on there. The French were there for a very long time conducting operations. Could you explain to folks, what is the Sahel region and why does it seem to drive so much instability on the continent?
So the Sahel is actually a vegetation. So when you are referring to Sahel, you are actually talking about a vegetation. And that vegetation is more of semi-arid vegetation, because that particular area is between the Sahara Desert and the savanna grassland in West Africa, especially moving to Central Africa. Now, if you want to look at it on the larger scale, the Sahel actually runs from the Atlantic coast in Senegal, Mauritania, all the way to Djibouti and Eritrea in the Red Sea. So that is quite wide. But typically in this era of security analysis, mostly when we mention Sahel, we are referring to the Western Sahel. That is, you're talking about countries like Senegal, Mali, Mauritania, Niger, Burkina Faso, and Chad, typically. So that is the vegetation is found is sandwiched by the Sahel and the savanna, and it's made up of short grassland and scattered trees. So if you stood at one side, you see very far away, and this also presents a very interesting security dynamic to the region. Thank you.
Awesome. So what drives that security dynamic? Because if you get out there, the amount of terrain you have to cover is absolutely vast. You do have cities and towns, but there's a lot of ungoverned space, unoccupied space. A lot of terrorist organizations we've seen take up root there over the past couple of decades. Is it an issue where, terrorist organizations make governance difficult, or is governance difficult and so, terrorist organizations or non-government actors can find safe haven there and conduct operations?
Yes, this is a very interesting question because the region is vast. If you took Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger together, it is larger than Western Europe. So we are talking of France, Germany, Belgium, the United Kingdom, all of them put together are not up to the size of these three countries, landlocked countries. So that is very significant. Now, in this case, we have different tribes, different ethnicities, different occupations. And traditionally, the occupation has been agriculturists who are sedentary, and then we have nomadic groups. These are people who move based on the season. They move their cattle, their sheep, and other livestock from one side to the other, one place to the other, based on climatic or weather conditions. So for hundreds of years or centuries, and if not millennia, the people living there have lived that life. And it makes the place very fluid in terms of the movement of people. So unlike the hard borders that we have in many places in the world, over there, it is very difficult to impose hard borders. It means, yes, juridically or on paper, countries have boundaries. But in terms of the movement of people, we have the most porous of borders or boundaries in that region. Now, if you that mixed with history, and what has the history been? That the region was mainly dominated by the French, and the French had this colonial administration that was initially called the policy of assimilation. They chose certain geographical areas to become labor reserve, so they did not provide those kind of necessary infrastructure and the services that were required or that many other colonies were received in West Africa, or let's say the rest of Africa. So unlike the British that used the indirect rule, using established institutions to rule the people or to govern the people, the French wanted direct rule. And in so doing, they had to stratify their administration. So in Senegal, if you lived in a city like Dakar, you could become a French citizen, you receive French education, and you were French. In fact, you could live in Dakar and still be a member of parliament in France at the time. But if you were found in the Sahel, that is the deep into the Sahel, you were not receiving any education, you were labor reserve. And sometimes they were forced to provide free labor. I mean, forced labor, So this was the history. And during this time, groups in the region, such as the Tuareg, wanted some autonomy or wanted to deal with the French directly, rather than be managed from these let's say, exalted colonies or colonial areas. So they asked for it. They asked for such They asked for such They asked for such autonomy or independence, and the French refused. And then after independence, they still asked, and the Malian government consistently suppressed such agitations. And so it made the place a bit. You could not say that it is attracting terrorists in and of itself. Neither can you say that something good has been done in the place to avoid terrorism. So that is how the region has been. The history, the geography, the ethnicity, and the dynamics really makes it some kind of safe haven of terrorism that it has currently become. And currently, the region is the epicenter of global terrorism in terms of number of attacks, and then the number of people who die from terrorist attacks.
Wow. So as far as terrorist groups in the area, what's the split generally between, how many of them are part of an international terrorist organization versus how many of them are just local actors with local grievances using terrorism for local political objectives? And then, of course, there's the mix where you have a local organization, but they adopt the branding of an international group. But really, it's a local team that decides, like, hey, we're Al-Qaeda today. Oh, we're ISIS tomorrow. We're whoever we need to be to build our own credibility. How do we understand the international versus domestic dynamic there?
All right. So thank you very much for this question. In terms of terrorism, as we see global terrorism creeping its way into the region, it started in the early years of the early 2000s, when the Algerian Civil War came to an end. Now, the war came to an end through negotiations, some mediation, and some talks. However, there were some radical elements in the civil war, the Islamists, who were not in position to talk to the government of Algeria. So they retreated southward in Algeria. And if you talk of southern Algeria, you're talking of northern Mali because they share boundary. And over time, this group became Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, Akim. And they swore allegiance to Al-Qaeda because then it was around the same time that Bin Laden attacked the United States of America. And so then that Al-Qaeda had become very popular among the terror circle. And people, we saw a lot of allegiances. And that those remnants of the Algerian Civil War pledged allegiance. So they used the control of illicit tobacco and other routes in the Sahara and the Sahel to raise funds for the activities at the time. Now, after some years, we had the fall of the Gaddafi regime in Libya. Now, with this, it brought two issues. Gaddafi had used the Tuareg in ensuring some order, so to speak, in Libya. That is in a way to survive. And after his overthrow, these guys came with a lot of arms because the armories were looted and whatever that was happening in Libya was chaotic. So it led to arms proliferation, very significant arms proliferation. And so they came down home to fight for their liberation, something they've been fighting for decades, as I've mentioned, with French colonialism and post-colonial era. And with that, it meant that they have the arms and they could now challenge the Bamako, that is the capital of Mali, that the south. But the second problem was that amongst these rebels, we had Islamists who were also Tuareg and who were motivated by Bin Laden's Al-Qaeda. So they formed what we call the Ansar Dine. And so these were Tuareg nationalists who were also extremists. So they created that. That brought friction between those who were legitimately looking for autonomy and these groups. But then, as we have mentioned, they already had an ally. Who was this ally? Akim, close by geographically. So Akim joined hands with these Tuareg nationalists who were Islamists. And that was what we saw in 2011, 2012. They took over Central Mali and created Islamic State. Before Abu Bakr in 2014 declared Islamic State in Mosul. So before that, it has already happened in the Sahel. That is what I mean. I see people talking about Islamic State, and it happened in Sahel. They implemented Islamic State. They were, amputating people, chasing people around, and destroying ancient tombs and all that.
Wow.
So that is something that happened. And with that, it led to what we call the French intervention. Because France saw that these Sahel states were on the back foot. The onslaught was very fast. They were taking over the area and they were helpless. So France implemented what we call or initiated Operation Sahel. And Operation Sahel was supposed to really stop the terrorists in its tracks and also cut the supply routes that linked the Sahel state to Libya and other northern African areas where they've got, constant supply of arms and other supply support. Now, Sahel was successful immediately because, that's air power that this estimate didn't have. They were dispersed, but we needed to have ground forces who were going to protect other settlements that had not been taken yet. And West African forces offered to help because, Mali is a member state of the Economic Community of West African States. So ECOWAS, that is the acronym we call ourselves ECOWAS. ECOWAS had to intervene, and they contributed forces to manage the ground operation while the French used air power to really pummel these extremists. In fact, initially, as I mentioned, it was very successful. And the second phase of the fight came, Operation Barkhane. Barkhane was to implement very good policies that will bring moderate rebels on the table so that these extremists could be separated from the moderates and therefore making the fight more effective. So Operation Barkhane was initiated, and Europe actually financed Operation Barkhane with other financial support and other support. And that was when the J5 Sahel. So France said, well, we need a military alliance of Sahel states. So we had Mali, Mauritania, Burkina Faso, Niger, and Chad coming together to form the J5 Sahel, first of its kind, to coordinate and cooperate in the fight against terrorism, alongside international forces that were protecting very strategic settlements in the area, because the terrorists, even though they had been dispersed, they still had the ability to hit some targets. But then again, the international forces were not too effective. And these extremists, as I've mentioned, they are locals. They are actually locals. So they know the terrain. They are not like Afghanistan, where the Mujahideen from Arabia and other places had to travel all the way to Afghanistan. Some of them were strangers. But in West Africa, these are indigents. They've lived there for years. The only difference is that they have adopted or they have shown their allegiance to Al-Qaeda. You know? Yes. So yeah. I think you want to intervene.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I was going to ask you, I mean, initial French operation, very traditional counterterrorism focus. I was surprised to hear you go into they actually try to implement policies to get moderate factions to the negotiating table, because that seems like a step that most people skip in counterterrorism. But, you know, it's interesting, since that operation started, we've seen coups in, I think, 3 different countries in the area. Was it Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger of all coups? Yeah. I might be missing one. What was going on domestically in those countries? We're in the midst of this counterterrorism operation and this attempt to get moderate factions onto the table, that this very countries that were supposed to be fighting this domestically have coups in their governments and get overthrown. Because this seems like there's a chronic governance issue that prevents any sort of counterterrorism fight from being effective, whether it's domestically driven or internationally driven.
Yeah. So with this, Barkhane was effective initially. And then in 2016, 2017, we saw the reorganization of the terror groups. By this time, the groups have become many. Katina, Masina, Ansarul, Ansardin is already there. Then we have Al-Murabitun and many groups. So there is this very cunning Tuareg nationalist who is also the founder of Ansardin. His name is Iyad Ag Ghali. He decided to form a federation of terror groups under Al-Qaeda umbrella. And that became the JNIM, Movement for the Protection of Muslims and Islam. The acronym is in Arabic, of course. So that was created in 2016, 2017, and they started hitting international forces position and other positions of government forces in the area. Now, this meant that the militaries in these countries felt that, well, they are at the forefront of the fight against terrorism. And therefore, they have every right to also be in charge of power. Because according to them, the civilians could not understand what the fight. And so by taking office, they were sure to end terrorism. And almost all these governments mentioned the fight against terrorism, or military governments mentioned the fight against terrorism as part of the reasons they took power from the civilians. And that started in 2020. Wow. So it was actually the insecurity that was used as a pretext, or maybe it was really a reason, but in all these coups, insecurity was mentioned as a reason for the coup. And that was how come the civilians were moved. And the interesting thing, maybe that question is going to come, but it has really proven not to be the case, that the military will do better when they are in charge of government.
Yeah, as someone who spent a lot of time in military organizations, I always shudder to think what happens when you put them in charge of anything. much less themselves. But so we have coups in these three countries. I'm just going to go out on a limb here and saying that, coups in major countries in the Sahel doesn't lead to more stability. How did these coups impact events on the ground, and how do they impact the ability of the international community to participate in counterterrorism operations?
Yeah. So specifically, when the Mali coup happened in 2020, there was a lot of pushback, both regionally and internationally. Regionally, the ECOWAS Protocol on Good Governance and Democracy did not allow coups in member states. So if you stage a coup, you were sanctioned automatically. And that happened. So Mali, the pushback really allowed the military, or forced the military to allow a hybrid government made up of civilians and the military. So the junta leader decided to be vice president and allowed a civilian to be president. And then we also had a civilian prime minister. And the ministerial appointments went, both ways, military officers and the civilians. After less than a year, that government collapsed because there was another coup by the same junta leader who was then vice president, Simi Goita, and he consolidated his rule and ended the hybrid government. The only thing he did was to was to get the services of a civilian prime minister in order to create a semblance of some civilian presence in the government. But eventually, he was also, removed from office. And currently, the prime minister is a former military colonel, and that is what it is. Now, when they took over, immediately they sought the protection of the regime under the guise of enhancing the terror fight. So Wagner was brought in. And at the time, Prigozhin moved in there, signed some kind of deal with Mali. Mali is one of the top 5 producers of gold in Africa. And among the top 3 in West Africa. And so Prigozhin signed a deal such that Wagner was going to take gold or get gold concessions and other mineral concessions while they provide security and fight terrorism. Then again, when they started, some of us came out boldly and we told them this is not going to work. Wagner has not fought terrorism anywhere, ever.
Yeah.
And so what we see was regime protection rather than the fight against terrorism. Because once a coup is staged in Africa, there is always the beginning of another coup being planned against those who just staged the coup. It's always like that. So the regime wanted protection, and they thought that Wagner could help. And Prigozhin, with his charisma, came down and he got a deal. And the Russia at the time, Moscow also used Prigozhin a lot as part of its foreign policy, because Russia was not going to send military for it to look like other countries that it keeps criticizing. So it tried to use the PMC to get the job done. And then the leader of the PMC get paid. So that was what was happening. So if you saw the private jet of Prigozhin and all that, some of the monies came from Mali and the Sahel.
Wow.
So that was the situation. Yeah.
So we get this coup in Mali, and then the new government puts a token civilian presence in the government to avoid sanctions, and then brings in the Wagner Group, Russian mercenaries, to come in and protect themselves, but not necessarily combat terrorism. This sounds like it's going great.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned before this federation of terrorist groups that got together, and I know from personal experience they got much more effective and much more Connecticut 2017, 2018 timeframe. They went after some guys in my former unit at that time in Tongo Tongo. Okay. But what innovations are coming out of this space and going into the larger international, terrorist community? Because we do have international connections here, even though there is a bunch of domestic drivers of instability. And we've seen terrorist groups innovate from one country to another globally. So do we see any innovations with terrorist groups in the Sahel that make their way into the Middle East, into Europe, into South America?
Yeah. So, in recent times, I've written on the unregulated migration. People moving from West Africa and trying to reach South America onwards to the United States. Others going to Europe through the Canary Islands. Others still use the Western Mediterranean, Central Mediterranean, and Eastern Mediterranean route to get to Southern Europe. Now, the concern has been that, yes, West Africa, our major concern is that the terror cancer is growing. Spreading so fast. But then again, our partners who help us or support us to fight it may also have some of these guys mixing with these migrants to reach Europe and other places to form sleeper cells where they strike whenever the need be for them. So these are real concerns, how they can spread. So far, we've not recorded anything directly of the sort that, well, we found this person and we can say with evidence that he's a member of JNIM and he's trying to reach the United States through Mexico, or he's in Canary Islands and all that, because there are legitimate concerns about migration where push factors like unemployment, instability, insecurity, and others pushing people to, embark on these dangerous journeys. But the issue has to do with the mobilization and the financing, terror financing in West Africa. About 2 years ago, I wrote that if we are not careful, we are going to have terror groups in West Africa sponsoring global terrorism. So Al-Qaeda in West Asia could receive a lot of financing from the Sahel, because these guys are currently interested in gold. They provide security to artisanal miners in order to take gold in kind. They in exchange for gold. And this gold is sold in coastal states in a very sophisticated business to raise funds. Also cattle as a zakat. Recently, the Trump administration announced that it was going to sanction the movement of cattle. Yes, we've said this for a long time, but I don't know, maybe it's following some good years now. But the issue is, how do you stop it? How, this cattle move on along porous corridors. They actually, in fact, I know that some people buy cattle in Niger and they bring them on foot all the way to Ghana on foot. They are not in trucks. So how to stop it is going to be very difficult. So these are some of the things and then they also have the control. They also impose taxes. In fact, in the Sahel, some transportation companies or transport companies are paying levies or taxes to these extremists in order to have passage. Because if you don't, they are going to stop you and attack you.
Wow.
So
we have terrorist groups performing some of the functions of state, primarily the ability to collect and levy taxes.
Because we are dealing with a space. You are dealing with a space that is bigger than Western Europe. So when you are fighting in Berlin, someone is in Luxembourg imposing his own tax. And by the time you move from Berlin to Luxembourg, he is done with that. So that is the space is often overlooked. People sometimes, when people are looking at the size of countries, they tend to focus on populations rather than physical size. That we have to separate that, because the physical size, like you can have drones, and you will still be lacking in terms of gathering intelligence, because you cannot. Satellite images have their limits and all that, because these guys are moving with small motorbikes that are very difficult to sometimes trace. So these are the issues. Because of that, I feel that there is a danger of West Africa being used as global terror financing hub, because these groups are making a lot from them, from the locals.
Wow.
Yeah.
What do you think the overall impact of the French intervention, which I believe ended formally 4 years ago, do you think that was a net benefit or a net loss for the area? Because I'm just thinking cynically in my own mind. The French came in, they provided military support and trained military personnel in order to to conduct counterterrorism operations. And then, a decade later, we're seeing those same militaries overthrow their governments. And it just seems like there's this vicious problem where if a Western country tries to come in and build military capacity, that they seemingly also build a mechanism to destroy the government that they're there to support.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. Yeah, it appears that France is very unpopular, and it doesn't appear that is it. It's very unpopular in West Africa. If you look at the history or you consider the history I gave at the beginning of this interview, you realize that over the years, there's been another dimension that I still have to explain. That is the post-colonial French arrangements. The French did not leave their colonies like the British did. The British granted independence and left. And they had economic interests that they managed very well, but largely the political control was not there. But with France, the apron strings were still tied to their colonies, even after independence. And that started with Charles de Gaulle in 1958. He felt that, well, the colonies have been very instrumental in helping France to survive Hitler. And so if they should give them absolute independence, so to speak, then it is going to be at the detriment of metropolitan France. So they put an arrangement that if you want to be outside the French community, something they created, post-colonial creation, that they were going to create the French community. If you don't want to belong to it, you have a referendum and then you leave it. But if you want to belong to it, then you stay. And the Republic of Guinea, currently producing about 25% of global bauxite, which is important metal in the aluminum industry. Guinea decided to opt out, that, well, we don't want to be part of that arrangement. And what happened to Guinea is one of the dark incidents in history, where France took everything away from the country, including asphalt. I mean, the roads that had been constructed were scrapped off because that country decided not to be part of the French community. So it took 10 million pounds at a time from Ghana. That was a very young, independent country, to help. That money was given to Guinea for Guinea to survive in terms of liquidity, because medicine and other health facilities that the French had put up were all raised down because Guinea had opted not to be part of the French community. Now, with that history and what followed, it means that other colonies decided to be part of their French history. At least the Guinea example was set. And so many people didn't want to go that route. And with that, it created, and France had a first option to reject resource exploitation, and all those stuff were put in place in these countries. And over years, dictators emerged in these countries, and France seemed to be supporting them somehow. Again, so the population saw France to be a perpetual oppressor. This is besides the point that metropolitan France, after Charles de Gaulle, had become more liberal and more, open society. I mean, the kind of strongman leadership that Charles de Gaulle provided had been left behind. But in terms of West Africa, France continued to support dictators. We still have about a 93-year-old man in Cameroon who has ruled since 1982. I wasn't born at the time. And then we have in Gabon, until recently, one family, a father and a son, ruling the country, Republic of Togo. And those things. So the people always saw. In modern times, people have seen the French post-colonial arrangement as not beneficial to the ordinary person, but to the elites in these countries. And that's how come the coup makers capitalize on these to create good propaganda against France. It was not that Operation Sahel and Operation Barkhane were not important. They were very important. Without these operations, things could have been worse. And the French did very well with that. But currently, the junta or the juntas are using this against the European country, and they seem to like it because, anything that is happening in these countries, they are blaming France for it. And if you are not someone who is very knowledgeable about the region, you believe it. But that's part of their propaganda, to survive. Yeah.
Wow. Is there a way, because the French operation was by all means, as from a counterterrorism standpoint, effective at the time, but the history is clearly complicated. It just seems, what is a way that any sort of non-local partner, whether it be France, Britain, America, even China or Russia, even though particularly not a fan here, but hey, they have a global reach. If another state wanted to come in and help the region, because they are concerned about this being a hub of terrorist financing, they are concerned about migrant crises stressing out, social safety nets in other areas. Is there a way that the international community, either collectively or just a couple powerful states, could come in and help the region? What would that approach look like ideally?
Yeah.
Or is this something where everyone just needs to get out of there, let them handle it themselves, and let it play out because there's no way to help without causing more problems?
So firstly, they need help.
Okay.
They seriously need help. They can't fight terrorism. It's gotten worse. The military has failed as far as the promise or their promise of ensuring security was concerned. They failed, and across board. And so, yes, in Burkina Faso, you see some. So you do not ignore the physical security and tell me that you are constructing some kilometers of road, and so I'm okay. I'm not okay, because after the road, I'm going to be attacked. I'm going to be killed. So they need help. And fortunately, they've come to that decision that we really need help and we have to engage constructively rather than the kind of propaganda. Now, after years, the Russian Wagner and other groups and the Russian African Corps has failed too, because they could not provide. They were using all kinds of terror measures that were counterproductive. That actually enhanced recruitment for terror groups, because if you go to a community and shoot indiscriminately and kill indiscriminately, then you are breeding more terrorists. If I went to the bush and I came back and I heard that you've killed my family wrongly, then I might join the terror group to get revenge. Not necessarily because I love what they are doing, but because I want to seek revenge for the death of my family. So these are the things that Wagner did, and it was counterproductive. And now these regimes have come to that conclusion that they will need constructive support. Yes, now France, no matter how effective France is not a good idea. In fact, it will be a threat to their regime to actually invite France back. It will be seriously, not because France is bad, but then, the narrative I gave, that has been propagated over the time. It doesn't work. So recently we've seen the return of the United States to the region. Some health deals here and there. And then as late as yesterday, I had to discuss the issue of U.S. returning for intelligence operations in Mali, because Mali want to really reach a deal for U.S. to start intelligence operations back there. And Mali is a landlocked country that shares boundary with 7 other African countries, including Algeria, Mauritania, Senegal, Guinea, Cote d'Ivoire, very important, Burkina Faso, and then Niger. These are the 7 countries that Mali shares border with. So intelligence gathering in this country is very important. You know the dynamics, the movement of terror groups, how the supply lines and all that. And U.S. has state-of-the-art drones and other surveillance equipment and operations that can really gather good intelligence to undo some of the harm that's on the way coming. And I think that in that respect, I think the military governments are becoming more pragmatic rather than the initial seemingly zero-sum antagonistic approach to issues.
What advice would you give a country like the United States? We could like to consider ourselves, the bastion of freedom and democracy around the world, greatest nation on the earth, go America. We're coming back into Mali. We're supporting this government, but the ultimate cure for terrorism is good governance. So if we're coming in and we're working with Mali, do you think America should be more focused on providing intelligence support, providing military support, or should it be more focused on government reform? And the next question is, like, as an outside player, is that second lane even a place where America can play? Like, clearly that seems to be the long-term solution.
Yes, I've had an opinion on this. I started from a very entrenched position,
share.
And then over time, I've been softening my stance. Initially, I said that no democracy, no cooperation. And I went back to hello. Yeah. So I went back to Cold War politics. I said that U.S. never colonized Africa. The only problem that some Africans had with the U.S. was during the Cold War, when, because of the containment policy towards the Soviet Union, some coups were believed to have been backed by the CIA in Africa. And again, some coup makers were hosted in the White House. So Hassani Habre in Reagan White House, Mobutu Sese Seko with Reagan, and all those pictures brought some kind of accusation of double standards. That, well, U.S. preaches democracy. We know that is a very important value. But how come during the Cold War they were with these dictators who had come to power with the use of the barrel or all that? Yes, the argument has been that, yes, it was the Cold War and all values were buried. So security first, containment first, and other things could follow. But currently, we have the post-Cold War. We have, please, I hope it's still, hello? Okay. So post-Cold War, we had this migration towards liberal institutions and democracy. But currently, we seem not to have that. We seem to be backtracking because the coups are trying to reverse this. So some of us had the position that the United States should not, as a matter of principle, cooperate with military regimes that were suppressing their people, because it will be counterproductive and it will worsen the violent extremist phenomenon. However, with the spread of the cancer and the way the wind seems to be in the sail of the extremists, there is the need for urgent intervention or support to the regional government to fight this or stop them in their track before any institutional or democratic path can be taken. Because how do you hold elections when in vast areas you have extremists taking over and imposing taxes? So you need to reach some stability. So that is where we are. But so currently, the U.S. need to support militarily and security-wise. It's supposed to give a lot of support. However, it should not be without conditions. There should be some conditions that, well, we are going to help you, but on condition that you transition to some participatory democracy or some inclusivity in the political space in order for stability in the long term, because we cannot be here forever. We cannot support you forever. At a point, we have to leave. And we believe that the only thing that can sustain any kind of security that can be achieved is by involving the different groups, sitting down to talk and allowing participation in the political space.
Gotcha. Now, particularly on the west coast of Africa, there are several very successful, very stable, economically viable, democratic countries. Ghana is a great example of it. Well, what type of spillover risk is there from, these conflicts in the Sahel, these military authoritarian regimes, these terrorist organizations? Do you think that the ring of democratic states that surrounds them is an effective buffer against their expansion? Or can the problems in those spaces
So in West Africa,
spill over into the rest of West
there
Africa?
are only 2 countries that have never experienced military rule since independence. And these are Senegal and Cabo Verde or Cape Verde, an archipelago off the coast of Senegal. Now, that means, that was a former Portuguese colony. That means Ghana has had its own share of coup d'etats, about at least 5 successful ones and countless unsuccessful. The only time we've never experienced coup, the last coup we experienced was in 1980. Successful coup was in 1981. In the 80s, we had a lot of unsuccessful ones. And since 92, when we transitioned to democracy, we've never had any coup attempt since 1992. This is a good story. You take Nigeria since 99. But in Nigeria, last year, there was a reported coup attempt. It was in the planning stages. And it was due to some maybe miraculous intervention or interception of some information that led to the discovery of such conspiracy. Now in Ghana, and several countries around, we found some stability, Benin, Togo, and others. But some of them have very good democracies where parties come in and go. There are 2 turnover tests where Party A comes to office, Party B gets Party A off, and Party A returns. It's something that some countries have achieved. Ghana has achieved that. Liberia has achieved that. Nigeria, not yet. Since 99. And with that, the situation still remains volatile. The current president of Ghana has mentioned last year that we are not beyond coup d'etats. It can happen. Despite the stability. Yes. And so whatever that is happening in the Sahel is everyone's concern. It is not that there is some paradise and that is untouchable and that can have nothing happening to it. We can all be at risk of military takeovers. The only thing is that you need to do everything possible to stop it. And especially the soft aspect of things, participation, women empowerment, trying to bridge the poverty gap at the regional levels and at the social levels. For instance, most of the northern parts of coastal West Africa are savanna. And as I mentioned, those who experienced British colonial rule did not go that deep. They left the local chiefs there. So development was not also very good. So in Ghana, there's been some conscious efforts to bridge what we call the north-south gap. In Nigeria, northern Nigeria is currently very tumultuous because of the poverty. If you compare the north and the south, the north is, chronically poor. And that is a situation that we have to look at, the geographical gap and the social gap. The several youth unemployment, the high youth unemployment, the issue of corruption, where the youth feel that, well, these guys are not in for interest. Now, when the youth continue to feel like that, when any rogue actor in the military decides to take power, he is likely to get the support of these youth because they feel that the civilians are corrupt. It happened in the Sahel. It can happen in the coastal states as well. Yeah.
Wow. What do you think policymakers in places like Washington, D.C. most misunderstand about the Sahel region
One thing
and what's
that
going on there and what needs to be done?
Consistently
But where are the gaps
and
there?
The last time I was in Nairobi during the Silent Warrior Summit, I mentioned it to the special forces that had met there that we overlook the essence of traditional authority in a place like the Sahel. The people will queue to vote for politicians, but they respect the traditional chiefs than the politicians. So when you are dealing with the leadership, always factor in the traditional authority. The politicians may come and go, the traditional authority is always there. Once they are chosen, they die in office. They are chiefs. And these guys understand the long-term dynamics than the politicians who have had degrees and the PhDs. So if you try to involve these guys, they are likely to reveal a lot to you. And I've always used what General David Petraeus did in Iraq when the tide turned against US forces, where he decided to use Sunni tribesmen and the chiefs, engage with them in order to sideline al-Zarqawi, the al-Qaeda leader in Iraq. And eventually, the tide turned. You do not ignore traditional authority and institutions. In developing countries, these institutions are very vibrant and more robust than they are credited for. So these are some of the things.
Okay. So you can't assume, especially at the local level, that democratic governance or good governance is going to look and operate the same way in a Sahel country as it is in, Western Virginia. It's just not quite the same dynamic. It almost seems like a local version of like the a constitutional monarchy, where you have this elected body that has political power, but you have this separate familial institution which carries a lot of the authority of the state, even if they're not part of the government formally. Okay, cool. So if we're gonna expand our minds here and think 10 years ahead, if 10 years from now we have a secure and stable Sahel that maybe we don't have fully democratic governments in power, but we no longer see hotbeds of transnational terrorism going on. There's some stability in the region. 10 years from now, what were the, one or two key things that either the international community or the regional community decided to do to make that happen? And if it is just a complete shit show, pardon my informal French there, what were the one or two things that we all got really, really wrong? What pushes this to success and what pushes this to failure in the next 10 years?
No group of people should be marginalized in finding stability in the Sahel. No group. The Fulbe, the Tuareg, because there are good people in there who, in fact, there is a group in the Tuareg, among the Tuareg, that believe that they want to be part of a unitary state of Mali. They don't even want a federal state. So there are people, it's a spectrum. It is not monolithic that these guys all think the same. There's no group of people in this world that think the same. If you go to the Kurds, there are Kurds who will cooperate with Turkey, and there are Kurds who will want autonomy. It's the same thing with the Sahel. There are Tuareg who will want to side with Al-Qaeda, and so you have to involve all of them. Something happened about 2 years ago. The head of JNIM actually called a meeting of all Tuareg nationalists, including moderate rebels. And they attended it because at the time, the Malian government had ended the Algiers talk. That was supposed to, that is the negotiation between Mali and the rebels, legitimate rebels. So these are the things, marginalization. As long as we will involve each and everyone, all the groups in the talks, these extremists who do not want to talk will be marginalized and be dealt with decisively. But if we are going to ethnicize counterterrorism, if we are going to tribalize counterterrorism, then we are going to have innocent people dying, and those who survive these guys are going to join the extremists. And we are going to have worse scenario. So participation, inclusivity, and involvement of all and sundry is one of the best ways. That when I see that, then I know that in the next decade, we are going on the right path. We are going to see something good. But if people are going to say, well, the Fulani or the Fulbe are the troublesome people here, or the Tuareg are troublesome, then we are going to have a lot on our hands. Because you are not going to end a whole ethnicity. You can't kill everyone, and they will keep coming. And even good people will be hurt in the process, and that is counterproductive. Wagner and Russian mercenaries did that in the Sahel, And that's what we are seeing. The result is what we are seeing. But when I also see, so the opposite will mean that we are going in the wrong direction if we decide to marginalize people. And then there's also the issue of the soft approach. Apart from the kinetic, that is a socio-economic approach. Providing the jobs, providing that is employment, providing economic support, women empowerment. Women empowerment. In northern Ghana, we have people who pick shea nuts. It produces shea butter, a very valuable ingredient in the global cosmetic industry. And it is a wild tree. It's in the forest and in the savannah, and they pick them. Recently, Ghana signed a deal with the Netherlands to supply the shea butter. Now, the thing is it that we are just going to pick it cheap from these women and then make the money? Those along the supply chain will make much of the money, and we leave those women in poverty. There's supposed to be some arrangement where there's a win-win game. The women on the ground get enough. And when women are empowered, the household is safe. The provision of education, food, and all that. And when the child is occupied with something meaningful, it is very difficult to radicalize such a child because he has a future. And these are the issues.
Gotcha. Well, I hope we see more of what you're hoping for in the next 10 years and less of the Wagner Group running around dropping bodies in the jungle. But Fidel, thank you so much for coming on and talking with us today.
Thank you so much, sir. Thanks for having me.
Appreciate you, sir. And we'll be in touch. Thank you so much.